can start.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome to this session on land management in time of crisis, which is a part of this second Arab Land Conference. Before going to the subject, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this very important and very timely event for the Arab regions. So as long as our topic is concerned, let's start with some figures. As you may know it, we have today a number of 12.5 million internal displaced persons in the MENA regions. And 5 years back or 7 years back, there was only 3.5 million. So we see this increase of number. What does it mean in terms of land management? I think those people have been displaced. They left behind them property. They left behind them, you know, some kind of ownership. Now, whether in displacement, who is taking care of that? But at the same time, when these people decide to come back home, we have whole issue of contentious that need to be dealt in the process of recovery. So what we learn from our work as a GLT and World Bank, GIZ, is that land is a trigger of conflict. We see land being a driver of conflict in many contexts, not only in the MENA regions, but as a part of the world as well, and can be at the same time a bottleneck for recovery. It means that when it's come to rebuilding a nation state, land could be a bottleneck in a sense that you have one of conflict to deal with that. But today as well, take into consideration the context of the MENA region, we have some emerging factors. One of these factors is climate change, which is putting pressure on resources, and we have scarcity of resources and water and others, and we see making narrow the land asset and very small for people to live there. At the same time, we face this issue of competition around these scarcer resources. But also we have urbanization, where we see urban sprawl happening in many countries in the MENA region without any control of the land expansion. It has been demonstrated in the MENA region that cities are expanding more than the population. So it means that there's no correlation between population growth and land management in the particular area. But at the same time, we shouldn't see this land conflict or land crisis as just, you know, a bottleneck, but an opportunity as well. Because if you get a well-managed land system, a good land administration in the aftermath of the conflict, we can establish the building block for economic recovery. It's about building infrastructure, it's about promoting private investment, but also it's about promoting housing, which is a key element in the Arab MENA region in terms of recovery. Of course, today we have COVID-19, and that's something we need to reflect on, because COVID-19 is not about people dying, but also the social and environmental and economical impact of the COVID-19 of people, which are losing their livelihood system and not being able to pay rent in some context, but also at the same time to protect their tenure system in others' context, which means that we are in different place two years back and today, where we need to reflect what is the best way to manage this land to serve the purpose of reducing inequalities, but also to serve the purpose of contributing to a very holistic recovery system of our economic system, but also in the protection of environment. Because right now, I think this ICC report has demonstrated the link between climate change and land management. And one side effect of that is increased conflict and competition in many parts of the world. So today, I mean, our panel is looking into different angles from different experience in the MENA region. But the question I'm asking myself, take into consideration all these parameters, we talk about it, whether it is a bottleneck of opportunity, what kind of approach do you want to have to address the issue of land management in the context of post-conflict, but also in the context of prevention, because better prevent than just, you know, acting after things happen. What type of land policy do we need? And today we are talking about humanitarian and development nexus, which means that we cannot wait to finish humanitarian action to go to development. We need to have a correlation with them. And what is the place of land along this continuum of humanitarian and development? Second question, what type of land administration do we need? Because right now we have increased technology. I mean, we could deny it. I mean, the transformation technology is moving fast, but do we really need this? But do we really need this technology in the aftermath of the conflict? What kind of land administration do we need fit for purpose? or blockchain. Those are some options on the table. My third question to the panelists, what is a community engagement and what could be the role of communities in terms of participation? And what are the best practices we can scale up? Those are some questions we need to look at today to be innovative, but also to serve the purpose of this conference to make sure at least we have a concrete outcome to support policy or programs in a way that we are dealing with land in our, in the aftermath of conflicts. So my name is Umar Silla. I'm the director of the Africa office and former leader of GLTN, but now dealing with the Office of Africa. And today we have four panelists that I'm going to introduce to you. We have Tala Kamure from Human Habitat Lebanon office. He is a housing policy analysis. We have Nicole Tabet, who is postdoctoral researcher, and from the French Red Cross Foundation. We'll have Leila Ziba, who is a PhD candidate from the University of Leuven, Department of Architecture, Research Group, Urbanism and Architecture, International Center of Urbanism. And lastly, we'll have Karwan Yassen Sharif, who is from ICLA, NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, as project coordinator based in Mosul and area office. Without further ado, let me ask our first presenter to come in, which is Tala. And Tala will present the following topic: managing land right and ownership in the aftermath of the Beirut blast. So in terms of rules of the game, every presenter will have 15 minutes sharp. Beyond 15 minutes, I will cut you off. And after all the presentators, we'll have 30-minute discussion and question from the floor, because we want this session to be interactive and to allow others as well to bring their input to this Arab Land Conference. So, Tala, you have the floor. Back to you.
Thank you, Omar. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I will share my screen, and please confirm that you can see it. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
I think the attendees can see the screen, but we can't.
See it.
Just give us a sec. We're still not seeing your screen.
I will try to share it again.
Perfectly clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry for the delay. Hello again, everyone. My name is Tala Amouriye. I'm the Housing Policy Analyst with the UN Habitat Country Office. And today I am going to be presenting about responding to land and housing rights in the aftermath of the Beirut blast. So as most of you know, on August 4, 2020, an explosion at the Beirut port caused widespread casualties and material damage, killing over 200 people and injuring more than 6,000, and severely impacting the dense urban fabric and infrastructure surrounding the area. The explosion damaged the core of the city, which is recognized as a cultural hub across the Mediterranean. And the most affected areas are known for their historic and rich urban fabric. More than 300,000 persons were directly impacted, with 60,000 households incurring damages to their homes and thousands left homeless. In addition to this, the blast has exacerbated existing inequalities, creating further vulnerabilities and tensions with and across social groups in Beirut. The economic crisis has been further exacerbated by this blast, impacting businesses and employment opportunities in the city and country at large. So I will start quickly by overviewing the areas affected by the blast, which you can see on this map and the red dots. So these were the areas that were severely damaged, which some of which are home to vulnerable and poor Lebanese and migrant workers and refugee communities. The government response has been delegated to the High Relief Commission as well as the Lebanese Army to coordinate all efforts of relief and reconstruction alongside the Order of Engineers and Architects, and a very quick mobilization of volunteers to support in the cleanup of rubbles and so on. And of course, in addition to that, the humanitarian response from the United Nations and its humanitarian partners in Lebanon launched a flash appeal to mobilize nearly $500 million in assistance for about 300,000 persons. And multiple multi-sectoral needs assessments were launched, where UN Habitat was also part of, in addition to co-chairing a temporary technical committee under the shelter sector response to the blast on HLP, on housing, land, and property issues, alongside NRC. So to quickly go over the sort of activities that UN Habitat supported following the port explosion, UN Habitat undertook a detailed assessment of buildings in need of structural repair as a basis for emergency cash for rent that is currently being rolled out. And this intervention provided 800 eligible households with safe shelter options for a minimum of 3 to 4 months. In addition to that, in the neighborhoods heavily affected by the blast, UN Habitat is undertaking minor repairs and in collaboration with the UNESCO and the Ministry of Education, we undertook a detailed assessment of 150 private schools affected by the explosion and are now currently overseeing the holistic rehabilitation of around 33 of these schools in the affected areas. Many medical centers in the area were severely damaged and some even left incapable to function in the middle of the COVID response, which was very critical. One of these facilities is the only national HIV and tuberculosis center based in Beirut. So UN Habitat engaged in rehabilitating the center through a Build Back Better approach, of course. In addition to that, we launched the Rubble to Mountains initiative following the blast, which is co-led by a consortium of UN and private sector and NGO partners. The initiative aims to prevent an environmental waste crisis similar to that which followed the Lebanese civil war in the 1990s. This initiative is to collect, sort, and reuse the debris left by the explosions and transform it into a material that will fill and reinforce mountains severely eroded by quarrying and build furniture for Beirut's public spaces. Beyond the immediate response to the most pressing needs lies the protracted housing situation in Beirut and across Lebanon. And to ensure that housing, land, and property rights of Beirut residents are protected, UN Habitat is currently addressing that through ensuring that heritage buildings, for example, are restored in compliance with the Directorate General of Antiquities. In addition to that, we are contributing to the overall coordination of the shelter response, co-led by UNHCR and NRC, and we are right now rehabilitating 10 multi-story residential buildings in the targeted explosion-affected areas and rehabilitating key public facilities as well. Now, to move to the HLP situation in Lebanon. So the situation that we are currently facing was pre-existing before the port explosion. Lebanon was grappling with issues related to housing, land, and property rights already before the explosion. The problems facing damage-inflicted areas include tenure disputes, unresolved inheritance issues, missing rights holders, and a lack of tenure documentation. These have been exacerbated after the blast, and affected residents include large numbers of old tenants, we call them old tenants, which are households holding rental agreements prior to 1992, when the rent control law was liberated. So these tenants have been at risk of eviction since the amendments to this law in 2014, And as always, in any crisis, the most marginalized population is affected the hardest. So this presentation highlights some of the many HLP challenges in Lebanon in the aftermath of the Beirut blast with regards to risk of eviction and securing and safeguarding shelter. The challenges are related to missing documents, property deeds, lease agreements that got lost during the blast or damaged. And also in the case of many tenants who rely on verbal agreements and are now at risk of eviction. Threats of eviction due to inability to pay rent or refusal to pay fees during damages, while damages are fixed. So owners plan to repurpose or upgrade the property, and owners arguing that the property is unsafe despite a lack of proper technical assessment, which leaves residents at risk of eviction. Refusal of some owners to rehabilitate as well is one of the HLP challenges that are being faced now, or to allow for a rehabilitation carried out by any third party. And this is particularly due to the fact that some tenants who might have rental arrangements that are about to expire is giving some owners some incentive not to rehabilitate for the purpose of not extending this lease agreement further. Other disputes include disputes between property owners and tenants on the responsibility to carry out and bear the cost of the repair related to the damage resulting from the blast. And in principle, the damages caused by the blast should be repaired by the property owner. However, many property owners lack adequate insurance and do not have the means or interest in repairing the buildings and properties adequately. And mind you, this is happening side by side with the severe socioeconomic crisis that has been going on in the country for the past year and a half. In addition to that, lack of clarity by the affected households on the criteria and procedures of governmental compensation mechanisms related to the damages caused by the blast, especially if repairs were conducted by a third party. Lack of awareness among people on who to seek for legal support, and lack of ability to seek recourse to the judicial system over HLP issues. And last but not least, pressure on property owners with a lack of financial resources to make necessary repairs to sell their properties to developers or investors who are coming into the blast-affected area. So in terms of damage assessment, the World Bank Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment estimated, of course, in addition to local authorities and the Lebanese Army and the Order of Engineers and Architects, undertook damage assessment to all buildings in the area. It was estimated between $1.9 and $2.3 billion in damage to the housing sector alone, not to also mention the infrastructure damage to small businesses and large businesses in the area, the hospitals, the schools. So a significant number of buildings with active occupancy are in need of immediate stabilization and structural rehabilitation. And although many residents were requested to evacuate these premises by the authorities, families refused to leave at fear of losing tenure or eviction or rental increase due to the repairs, or simply because they don't have any other alternative measures. So the humanitarian community, including UN Habitat, is supporting some of these vulnerable households. Now, it's important to mention that there were two important pieces of legislation that were issued in the aftermath of the blast to safeguard housing, land, and property issues. The first one, Law 185, is an attempt to protect those most affected by the blast. So this legislation aims to granting the heirs of those who passed away in the blast a waiver from the inheritance fees that are considerably high for many vulnerable families, provided that they submit to the Ministry of Finance the required declaration and documents and so on. The legislation further issued waiving the built property tax due in 2020 for all residential and non-residential buildings damaged due to the blast. And the law also waives the municipal fees for the year 2020. The second piece of legislation, 194, aimed at limiting sales to real estate developers in the affected areas in order to protect it from exploitation and speculative measures. Hence, transferring the ownership of any real estate property in the areas affected by the blast, namely Marfa, Saif Mdawar, and Dermel, are prohibited for 2 years, starting the entry into force of the law, which is September. And in order to protect the tenants in the area, existing rental contracts for damaged buildings are valid even if the property is severely damaged, and rights of tenants regarding these existing contracts are preserved. The government also created a committee headed by the Lebanese army to receive and inspect all documents pertaining to a damage assessment and to estimate the compensation, so the valuation of the compensation for every real estate property. And in addition to that, the Ministry of Culture will put in place a separate plan for the reconstruction or restoration of the damaged buildings classified as heritage, which were very abundant in the area affected by the blast. Now, to conclude, in terms of recommendations that we have learned from this unfortunate event, the assessment of the HLP context prior and during the intervention is very important. This includes conducting HLP due diligence activities and monitoring the situation during and after the shelter intervention has been completed to best assess the long-term impact that the shelter intervention had on the HLP situation of the household. So to ensure HLP mainstreaming in the Beirut port blast response and the inclusion of HLP considerations in the shelter intervention and the adoption of a do no harm approach, we had to join forces with the interagency coordination to ensure that rehabilitation works would be accompanied by a signed agreement that would not allow the owners to increase the rent, for example, for the residents that were already living in the area. It's also recommended to mainstream HLP in the shelter response through the provision of tenure security components, such as an official lease agreement between property owner and tenant, or any kind of occupancy free of charge or rent reduction or freeze in the response, in the shelter response, and link them to the provision of legal services. And to closely coordinate with the legal actors under the protection sector and refer matters related to information and rights provision, counseling to collaborative dispute resolution, mediation, and HLP cases to legal actors following the provided referral pathways, especially for vulnerable individuals and groups. And lastly, in collaboration with legal aid actors to raise awareness on the provisions of the relevant laws related to HLP and their implications on the reconstruction process in the damage affected area. To also promote compliance with the provision of the laws that were issued on suspension of legal and administrative and judicial deadlines and the waiver on inheritance fees and so on. And last but not least, to ensure the adequate implementation of the laws and the establishment of clear guidelines by the Council of Ministers on the amounts for the compensation of the damages due to the blast, the criteria, the modality of payment, and any other required directives, and to work closely with the local authorities, the municipalities, and the civil society groups to identify the most vulnerable households in need of HLP legal aid, and to track additional housing units and buildings that need direct intervention, such as cash for rent, for example, to connect the different actors working in the same area. I realize that I'm out of time.
I have 1 minute, Tala, to finish.
Yes. So I'm done. So, and also to ensure that the distribution of assistance within the compensation schemes is based on the need and on the vulnerability criteria when targeting the affected households without any discrimination related to nationality, legal status, religion, race, sexual orientation, and disability. To ensure alternative housing for temporary displaced while implementing a moratorium on evictions, to focus on localized solutions, for example, community-level housing stock mapping exercise, which aims to improve availability and quality of housing so that more families can access adequate housing regardless of nationality, to inform and consult the affected population, to adopt a participatory approach, and to enhance integrated programming and synergies related to the provision of shelter assistance and legal services altogether. And that's it. So thank you so much.
Shukran wallaka ta'ala. Thank you very much. I think this is a very unique case because we used to see, HLP issues after, flooding and after all this disaster related to climate change. But this one is particularly related to the blast. And I think this proactive action being taken by the international communities in addressing, the HLP issues, I think it was a very fundamental. First things we can learn from your presentation, this quick assessment has been established as a tool to allow to know the magnitude of the damage, but also what type of intervention do we need. But we note that as well, this blast comes with other type of issues that was not part of this, ecosystem of complexity of land in the Beirut system, and relate to the compensation, the lack of trust between tenant and others. But most importantly, we need to really praise this rapid, intervention on the legal system with all this law being taken in terms of moratorium, but also in terms of protecting, speculation measures and others. I think it was quite a very interesting process, and based on stakeholders' approach and working with local government and authorities, I think it was really a lot of lessons we can learn from this. Thank you very much, Tala. Without further ado, let's move to the second panelist, who is Nicole Tabet. Nicole will talk about tenure security for refugees in Lebanon and the occupancy fees of charge program in the Bar Elias locality. Nicole, you have 15 minutes. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for this event. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Valencia in Spain, and this research is funded by the French Red Cross Foundation. I will be presenting today my study on the occupancy free of charge program, shelter program for the Syrian refugees in Bar Elias. I will refer to the occupancy free of charge in the presentation as an OFC program, and how the program managed to secure tenure for its Syrian beneficiaries. So I will try to share the screen, the presentation. I just want to make sure that everyone can see this.
Yes, I can see it from Nairobi.
Okay. Okay, perfect then. So allow me first to introduce the context. Since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, humanitarian aid actors have been covering the basic needs of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And as of 2012, shelter was recognized as one of the most critical problems of the Syrian crisis in Lebanon. The Lebanese government refusal to establish official camps for the refugees, and the humanitarian actors called for longer-term shelter solutions, led to the design of new shelter alternatives. As the refugees crossed the Lebanese borders, the lack for affordable rental housing and their limited financial resources forced them to rent accommodation in unfinished apartments. Some international organizations will transform this trend of renting accommodation in unfinished apartments to design a program, the OFC program, a shelter program that provides shelter for the Syrian refugees while increasing the stock of affordable renting housing market. So this study will focus on the tenure security component of the program for Syrian living in Bar Elias and the Bekaa, how the program helped the beneficiaries live in their homes without the fear of forced evictions. This presentation examines the design, implementation, evaluation process of the OFC program. It will highlight the elements that helped increase the refugees' tenure security. And lastly, it will draw upon the program's challenges and lessons learned from its design and implementation. So in this study, I argue that although the program helped refugees secure housing for 12 months, it failed to achieve longer-term tenure protection. Once the program expired, refugees were once again subject to tenure insecurity and relationships of power with their landlords. To do so, I first study the evolution of the OFC and its specifics, showing how the program evolved, building on past experiences and adequately adapting to the needs of the refugees and to the needs of the host community. I will highlight the upgrades that allowed the program to secure tenure for the Syrian refugees during the implementation of the OFC period. Later, I state the program's outcomes and limits in preventing evictions and rent increases once the program was over. And I identify the challenges in securing tenure beyond the implementation period, concluding with a set of recommendations for future long-term shelter programs. So in this study, both qualitative and quantitative tools were used. Fieldwork took place between November 2020 and January 2021. Interviews were conducted with 15 staff members of different organizations involved in the implementation and the coordination of the OFC, including UNHCR, NRC, Save the Children International, Solidarité Internationale, and MEDER. 9 interviews with the Lebanese Ministry of Social Affairs, Shelter Response Coordinators, and Lebanese local authorities were conducted. And this was followed by a more targeted survey on the Beryl-Lies OFC program, carried out with 50 Syrian beneficiaries whose OFC contract had expired or was about to expire. A second survey was also conducted with a sample of 28 OFC landlords. So how does the program work? The organization will pay the rehabilitation works of unfinished apartments belonging to Lebanese landlords. In exchange, these landlords will host for a period of 12 months in general the Syrian household beneficiaries. And in that way, the organization can secure shelter for these households. In Lebanon, Syrian refugees' tenants' sources of tenure insecurity are generally related to the social and power dynamics with their landlords, the lack of rent regulation in the private Lebanese rental market, and rent debt or their inability to pay rent linked to restrictions on livelihood and access to work. In the first years of the OFC, tenure security component was very weak. I just want to add that the OFC have been implemented in Lebanon since 2013. So refugees were constantly at the beginning exposed to threats of eviction and forced evictions. Back then, Syrian households had no self-representation in the program. The organization and the landlord would sign both the OFC agreement without the involvement of the Syrian household. But as of 2015, this will change, and the OFC agreement will be signed by all 3 parties. This means that the household is now giving a better representation in the program, and the agreement now clarifies the rights and responsibilities of both the landlord and the household, giving them the certainty that in case there's a breach in the contract, consequences would be applied. Another component is the housing, land, and property rights component, added around the same time. It's a task force of both shelter and legal sectors team members created to monitor and to resolve tenure disputes during the OFC implementation period. They were just dedicated to resolving tenure disputes during the program. And as of 2018, a specialized dispute resolution team was created. Its job is to resolve tenure issues threatening the Syrian households, whether under the OFC or outside the OFC. So the OFC rehabilitation budget generally ranges between $1,500 and $1,800 per unit. The OFC, the works usually include weatherproofing, installation of walls, doors and windows, water, electrical, and sanitation systems installation, like for example, the installation of the stainless steel wash basins addition. The OFC follows the sphere standards of a minimum of 3.5 square meters for living space per person. Thus, 1 unit will equal 1 bedroom, will equal 1 Syrian household. The kitchen and the bathrooms are shared facilities by the households of the same apartment. So the outcomes. Based on the survey with 50 beneficiaries from 2018 and 2019, the study concludes that the program did improve the housing conditions of refugees living in unfinished apartments. The majority of the participants were satisfied with the works, and the participants secured, on average, a rent-free period of 10 months and 18 days. The program did secure tenure for Syrian refugees during the OFC program, while the participants were provided with 1 year supported OFC housing. The previous and the following years have seen them move back and forth to camps and between various private rentals. However, during their OFC period, issues around their tenure security improved. As I mentioned earlier, organizations enforced tenure security by monitoring the implementation and resolving early disputes that may lead to eviction. And according to the staff members, eviction rates during the OFC of 2018 and 2019 ranged between 2 and 5%. The program did increase the supply of affordable housing in Barreliers and boosted the local economy. Over the 50 units rehabilitated, only 2 were withdrawn from the rental market. The program encouraged the landlord to invest in the construction market. And for the works, the landlord would hire local labor, would buy the material from the town. Thus, the OFC supported the local market and benefited the local economy of Barreliers. However, and according to the survey, half of the beneficiaries moved out once the OFC was over, due to rent increases or to the landlord's unwillingness to rent the apartment to those beneficiaries. As for the 20 households who stayed in their OFC apartments and were now renting it, 9 were currently under the threat of eviction because of rent debt or rent increases. Therefore, as affordable as the OFC housing stock is, transitioning tenant rent or free rent to renting out a partially finished apartment turned out to be financially hard for more than half of the beneficiaries. Once the OFC expired, the refugees had to negotiate the rent price with the landlord, and these negotiations are not based on equal bargaining power. And negotiations for reasonable rent prices depended on the landlord's goodwill. Therefore, for a more sustainable tenure security, the program needs to be completed with a transitional phase during which rent is controlled. Organizations should negotiate a rent freeze period once the free hosting period is over. Aware that the 1 year period isn't enough to protect the households from evictions once the contract is over, one organization introduced the possibility of a yearly renewal for the most severely vulnerable households. However, in most cases, the contracts are not renewed to be able to reach as much vulnerable households as possible. The 1 year beneficiary can be expected to be able to pay the OFC apartment's rent once the program is over, as long as he doesn't have proper access to work. Therefore, an integrated approach of the program, focusing not only on shelter and legal HLP, but also on livelihoods, would lead to more sustainable results. The program needs to include all 3, shelter, legal, and livelihood sector in its implementation. Also, a multi-annual OFC program can have a much greater impact on the households and the landlords' housing situations. The majority of the landlords said they would have preferred a longer 3 years program instead of a 1 year one, allowing them to completely finish the works of their apartments. As for the staff of the humanitarian sector, this would have allowed them to secure their jobs during 3 years and develop expertise on the OFC program. So in that sense, a multi-annual OFC ensures more cost and time-efficient results. The refugees will enjoy better tenure security and will be able to build a stronger and wider social and financial capitals. And the landlords will be able to completely finish their apartments. To be able to do so, the current yearly fundraising cycle of the OFC program needs to adapt to the protracted situation of the Syrian refugee crisis today. Apart from a few exceptions, shelter organizations in Lebanon receive yearly funds for their OFC program. This means that the OFC cannot exceed the 1-year funded period and would need to reset for the following year, limiting the scope of the response. Therefore, ending short-term annual fundraising can pave the way for longer-term programs and solutions. A long-term funding multi-annual OFC program secures refugees tenure beyond the implementation period and benefits both the households and the landlords' housing situations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for this presentation about this Syrian refugee in Lebanon with the council for occupants for free of charge. Of course, I think it's a very attractive principle at the beginning when you see, how this tripartite agreement will lead to hosting those refugees and, help them access to secondary right, and also the establishment of the dispute resolution mechanism. But as you question it rightly, the whole problem is the sustainability of such a system. If after 12 months, you are left with a landlord or being evicted, I think there's some question we need to look at on this particular system. And that's the reason why I think one element we need to look at in this discussion is what to do and not to do in this particular context. Instead of increase the vulnerability, let's look at some durable solution as well. So I'm happy that you raise the issue of livelihood system to develop a local economic development system to allow those refugees to earn something to sustain their livelihood, but at the same time being able to pay rent. But what does it mean in terms of program and policy? I think that's a question I'm putting on the table that we can look at later. So let me go to the next panelist member. Let me see my notes. Right. The next panel is Leila Zibar. And Leila will talk about planning displacement in chronic conflict zones, a master plan approach for temporary camps, the case of camp in Iraqi Kurdistan. Leila is a PhD candidate, University of Leuven, Department of Architecture. Leila, you have 15 minutes.
Can you see my screen? Hi.
Very well.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your presence in this presentation. I'm an urban researcher and I'm working here to present to you this idea of humanitarian camps. So the goal of this presentation is to focus on what is conceived for displacement and planned for temporary, how it is rooting in the urban landscapes, and the impacts and the potentials in relation to people, land, and sustainability. The outline of this presentation, the focus is Kurdistan region of Iraq. The outline is for the presentation is the following. I will do a small introduction. Then I will briefly go through the historical development of the settlement approach and the current and the previous logics behind it. Then I'll focus a little bit more on the settlement planning for humanitarian camps, the displacement moves, revealing the region's nature as a chronic conflict zone. Then at the end, I will conclude by bringing to your attention the relationship between sustainability and forced displacement and the latent potentials of this approach in such context, what I call them chronic conflict zones. So to come closer, forced displacement has an unescapable impact on the urban reality, in not only on the land, but also on the lives of both displacees and their hosts. Humanitarian camps are urban forms, represent loss, rupture, disruptions of the ordinary associated with partly or entirely a disappearance of a place and the emergence of another. It is assumed that these places to come into being and fade away when the problem supposedly is solved. Today in KRI, about 250,000 of people are hosted in humanitarian camps. As you can see in the map here, the camps are planned and set using the humanitarian approach, and there is 35 humanitarian camps that are running to host displacees. This camp's lifespan is hardly predictable, though that is set for temporary. The inconsistent nature of aid that has been generating a large-scale problem of infrastructural fatigue of the host communities, a socioeconomic hardship, and environmental degradation, especially in conflict-ridden zones, becoming an overlapping problem between emergency and development, a full-blown crisis. This fact has been fundamental in employing the settlement approach for that it has been being developed by the Global Shelter Cluster to solve this problem and support these settings to possibility to become integrated with the host. However, to incorporate this humanitarian development nexus had its own problems. The focus basically was on main three issues: duration, urban integration, and sustainability, covering self-reliance, durability, and socio-economic resilience. So the use and this approach is not new. The focus on the human settlement as an approach to humanize and socialize the whole development process, and also to address the uncontrolled urbanization problem dates back to the 60s and 70s debate. The humanitarian development of this approach can be traced back to the 70s, especially in the Frederick Connie model, that himself being a former Marine, which is important in the later in our presentation. It's important to know that the order is related to provide, but also to manage. Sorry, something's happening. Okay. How far did we go? Can you see the previous slide?
Yeah, carry on. Please carry on.
Sorry about the problem. Okay. So to go back to my point again, so we are talking here about a military logic, but somehow in combination with self-built models and sites and services in terms of operation. Later on, this project and this idea has developed into to create this operative arena for humanitarian interventions, for donors and humanitarian actors. The components of these different models of the handbooks that have been traveling and going through countries have focused on three main components, which is the physical component, the material structure, the soft component, which is the non-material, or what we call the program, to make the physical tick, however, and the users in relation to operators of this machine and the camp dwellers themselves. These physical elements can be shifted and sorted in accordance to natural and human-made features, basically relying on existing connections to host communities' infrastructure and advocated to be proximate to urban centers to access, again, economic opportunities to share the services with the host. So moreover, in 2020, the released guidance note acted as a manual for the best service provision, again, in terms of service technical problems, where the operators of this machine can maximize this approach benefit to include the host communities and ensure a multi-sectoral level engagement. So the most important part that this use of this tool, the human settlement tool, is not new to the Iraqi context. The Iraqi context itself has a different models of the use of this program, as especially recognized in the National Housing Program schemes that has been developed by the Qiyadis Associates, which had Hassan Fathi working with them at the same time. However, after the autonomy agreement, this tool has been activated in the region, supposedly to improve the primitive situation in the unserved villages, and included also the reconstruction and modernization of the region's damaged part in earlier disputes. Again, the country, as we have already seen, and we will still continue to show, that it is an almost always chronic conflict. So though in the autonomy agreement, several promises supposedly were breached, and then related also especially to the conflict on the land called Arabization and the fight over rights. So these breaches led to another revolt, quickly collapsed with the Algerian Accord and the signed in 1975 between Iraq and Iran. This included setting a buffer zone, as you can see here. This buffer zone created in the name of the security of the people. So the setting this buffer zone was very important to keep an eye, and it reached its climax, these kind of disputes and conflicts, after the Iran-Iraq war with the Anfal genocidal campaign. Millions of people were evicted, thousands of towns were destroyed, and people were relocated in another form of collective towns. These collective towns were reduced forms of this modern village model and become a coercive iron grid layout to be filled with different modes of state provision, creating and issuing a dependency mentality that the region still suffers from so forth. Later on, this didn't end. In the wake of the Iraqi army defeat in Kuwait during the first Gulf War in 1991, a large scale of uprisings went all over the country, and it was easy for the former Iraqi regime to crush. Around 2 million refugees were displaced in the bordering countries in the mountains of Iran and Turkey, and the situation became problematic. So to solve this humanitarian problem again, the UN Security Council passed the 688 resolution to declare northern Iraq as a no-fly zone and a safe haven again for humanitarian intervention, granting a de facto autonomy to the state of the Kurds. So we can say that this period has the root of the humanitarian development approach marching towards sustainability in the KRI.
Leila, let me interrupt you a bit because the translator are saying the speed is too fast. Can you slow down?
Should I go slow down? Okay, I will try. But can you give me more time? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, let's try. So to solve again this humanitarian problem, the UN Security Council passed the 688 resolution, declared the northern Iraq as a no-fly zone, a safe haven for humanitarian intervention, and granting a de facto autonomy to the states of the Kurds in the area. We can say that this period has the roots of the humanitarian development nexus and using the settlement approach marching towards sustainability in KRI. We can divide this period to two phases. The first phase is the immediate relief, and the second phase is turning this relief into reconstruction and rehabilitation concentrated. So the first phase, which is the relief in the no-fly zone, it was initiated by a military intervention, which is again bringing the idea of military distribution. There were two operations, first starting with the Operation Provide Comfort, which created the safe enclaves and established in the hotspot of Iraqi Kurdistan a UN-protected enclave, and it was followed by Operation Encourage Hope. So the recommendation of setting this enclave was from Fred Cunney, who developed these models that we have shown earlier. And the work of the military forces started to set a series of rallying points. Ironically, these rallying points were actually former collective villages. Hence, this kind of idea of confinement has been transformed and subverted into the notion of relief. More than 10 resettlement camps were set in 2 months, while the Turkish camps across the borders were evicted to be closed. Using the development layout of the community, Cunney, who was mentioned earlier, was present in this event and helped to develop these marine camps set to adjust the needs to the Kurds. The logic shifted again in the settlement approach, iterating between military and relief. Even though the life-saving mission was accomplished, the situation remained critical, though that the humanitarian relief responsibility later was handed over to UNHCR, becoming again a humanitarian problem. Later on, this was a very unstable political and economic situation. There was an economic freeze and embargo, but in the 1995, the UN Habitat, under the Oil for Food program, has implemented the Settlement Rehabilitation Program, linking spatial rehabilitation, self-built models, and improvement of services, the urban and the infrastructure stability, to focus also on society to rehabilitate, including empowerment and capacity enhancement. Again, the model shifted from relief to development. In the early stages, it's very important here to notice that in the early stages from the program, the intent was to dismantle the collective town. However, with the vulnerability that cannot be actually addressed with the prolonged displacement and destructions of towns, these new towns became stable places somehow, and the desire to return was almost not there for different groups, as they cannot return to something that doesn't exist. Consequently, the collective town improvement became the main component, one of the main components of this program. Later on in the period after, this period is very important because it is after this after the Iraqi war and before the Syrian war. So there has been an economic boom, which was effective because the KRG got its legitimacy in the constitution of Iraq in 2005, and the effective budget allocation, which has rendered the region in a relative stability. This stabilization and prosperity gloss made the region a destination to go. The development projects also took more focus, and the UN agencies were more working on upgrading these collective towns and investing in, and the KRG government, the Kurdistan Regional Government, focusing on investing also in the upgrade of these settlements. Ironically, again, these former collective villages once set for confinement were transferred again to become receiving sites for displacees. These abandoned structures, the ones that were evicted where people went back to their villages, also were again filled in with refugees. Additional refugee settlements were annexed to some of these collective towns. Moreover, as you see here, the town of Chamchamal and Sorash, which were basically collective villages, have been merged and became a larger center attracting the people. Nevertheless, as we know, this development and progression never reaches its full potential, and the collective settlements were dismantled or abandoned, which were not dismantled or abandoned. There has been an uneven development, created an unprecedented inequality only experienced by poorest of the poor, especially with an unbalanced core periphery urbanization. Now, the period that we all have recently seen.
Leila, your time is over. I'll give you 3 minutes to conclude.
3 minutes, I'll finish. Okay. So the Syrian conflict and the ISIS war has rendered the habitable inhabitable, and the waves of displacees filled the country. In no time, humanitarian camps were mushrooming their way up, and 35 standardized iron grid settings covered the region to absorb these waves. So refugee camps are taking steps to become tent-free camps. Many NGOs, including the NRC, the Peace Winds Japan, provided materials, cash for refugees, who has been developing their own sites, which also has been a combination between operator and dweller. Later on, however, the situation for the IDPs is different. The IDPs are expected to repatriate. The situation is still in return mood, and the improvised camps are still working as a safe haven to make do until something happens. So at the end of the conflict, now the idea is to progress the integration for the refugees and repatriate the IDPs. However, with the different succession of instabilities, followed by the ongoing pandemic, the impacts are drastic, and the escalation and the decline of enabling condition has returned again to the emergency mode. This is despite the purpose of the production of these settlements. They have been acting as receiving structures for different waves, changing their meaning and iteration between operators and dwellers, and they are creating different modes of presence. This idea of having this constellation together could offer different modes of potentials related to decentralized and semi-centralized solutions. Thinking of scales is very important, and trying to find different solutions to lessen the dependency on funding, and thinking of circularity as a mode of livelihood and also spatial upgrade. So the question at the end remains, can the myth of sustainability be genuinely realized? Can these planned sites of displacement move beyond dependency and become enablers themselves? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila. I really like your perspective, the historical perspective, and drawing from long-term engagement of humanitarian resettlement and up to now, what is the current situation? And that's where the tough question is, where are we now? From those, different scenarios you mentioned, and now in the 21st century, where we have new technology, we have green energy, and we have all this opportunity. Have we improved people's life in IDPs camp and others? I leave it to the discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leila. Let me move to the last speakers, who is Karwan Yasef Sharif, who is a ICLA project coordinator in Mosul area office. And Mrs. Sharif will talk about the legal problem of the property liberated from ISIS, a comparative and analytical legal study. Ms. Sharif, you have 15 minutes. Over to you.
سيداتي وسادتي، مرحبا بكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أود باسمي وباسم مكتب NRC أو مجلس النرويجي اللاجئين مكتب العراق أشكر المنظمين هذه المؤتمر لإتاحة لي هذه الفرصة أقدم برزنتيشن تحت عنوان الإشكاليات القانونية للممتلكات المناطق المحررة من داعش أو آيسيس. في البداية أريد أركز أو أعطي نبذة مختصرة عن عمليات التنظيم داعش اللي مسمى الدولة الإسلامية في العراق والشام. بدأت بعمليات احتلال مناطق واسعة جدا في العراق. بدأت في محافظة موصل، احتلوا 4 محافظات عراقية. خلال ظلت سلطاتهم أو تحت سيطرتهم هذه المناطق لمدة 3 سنوات وأكثر. بعدما تحررت هذه المناطق في خلال هذه الفترة صار كثير من التصرفات القانونية تمام. نبدأ بالمفهوم التصرفات العقارية. نحاول نختصر خلال الموضوع هذا البرزنتيشن إلى 3 جوانب الأساسية. في الجانب الأول نتحدث عن التصرفات العقارية اللي قامت من قبل عناصر تنظيم داعش. ثاني شيء نركز على التصرفات العقارية صارت بين المواطنين خلال فترة حكم داعش خلال هذه 3 سنوات، لمواطنين ليس لديهم أي علاقة بالتنظيم الداعش ولكن عملوا تصرفات عقارية خلال هذه الفترة، ونشوف أمور القانوني لهذه التصرفات وآثارها شنو وين يصير نتكلم عنها حاليا. وحالة الثالثة التصرفات العقارية اللي يخص بالإيجار المحلات التجارية اللي بنت تنظيم الداعش خلال فترة سيطرة حكمهم في هذه المحافظات، وكيف تصرفت وياها الحكومة العراقية بعد تحرير تلك المناطق. طبعا تصرف عقاري أو قبلها نتكلم عن حق الملكية. حق الملكية أوسع نطاق أوسع حقوق العينية نطاقا، ويعتبر كل شخص من يملك الحق الملكية التملك على الشيء له حق في التصرف والاستغلال والانتفاع. طبعا تصرف وفق القوانين العراقية، وفق القانون المدني العراقي وقانون تسجيل عقاري، أي تصرف ملكية يعتبر باطل إذا ما يسجل في دائرة تسجيل عقاري. التصرف ملكية نختصرها المقصود أو نركز على البيع والإيجار، البيع والإيجار والشراء. أي بيع والشراء خلال هذه 3 سنوات اللي صارت مصيرها يعتبر باطل إذا ما مسجل بدائرة تسجيل عقاري. طبعا كان ماكو حكومة خلال هذه الفترة، وأصدرت وزارة العدل بالشهر الآب 2015 ببطلان جميع التصرفات العقارية التي تمت خلال فترة سيطرة حكم الداعش، بناء على ما بني على الباطل فهو الباطل. فنشوف الآثار القانونية لهذه التصرفات أو المشاكل اللي صارت البيع والشراء خلال هذه الفترة، كيف تصرفت حكومة. طبعا بعد ما سيطرت الداعش على هذه المناطق بدأت بالإخلاء والترحيل القسري خصوصا بحق الأقليات الدينية والقومية، لأن خصوصا محافظة النينوى يتكون من أقليات الدينية وقومية كثيرة، يعتبر multiple cultural. في إيزيديين، في شبك، في تركمان، في مسيحيين داخل مدينة النينوى. فهذين كلهم تواجهوا للإخلاء القسري ورحلوا لمناطق أخرى، وداعش وتنظيم الداعش تسيطرت أو تصرفت بالممتلكاتهم. جزء منهم باعت، جزء منهم أجروا للناس تابع إلهم، والناس عاديين بالأثمان أو باهظة يعني بأسعار رخيصة جدا تصرفوا فيها. نتكلم عن الطبيعة القانونية. الطبيعة القانونية للتصرفات العقارية التي قامت بها داعش مثل ما قلنا داعش اللي اعتبرت الحكومة العراقية كل تصرفات اللي صارت البيع والشراء والإيجار اعتبر باطل، بناء على ما بني على الباطل فهو باطل، ما عدا استثناء اللي صار. بنت داعش مجموعة المحلات تجارية، هذين المحلات بعد التحرير تلك المناطق بعض منهم صدروا القرار من وزارة البلدية بالتعامل مع الناس اللي كانوا مؤجرين هذين المحلات من تنظيم الداعش بتنظيم عقود جديد وعدم رجعية قانون على الأثر الرجعي. مثلا يوم اللي نظموا العقد وزارة البلدية بهذا التاريخ أجروه عن طريق المزاد العلني، وذلك بناء على قانون رقم 21 للإيجار وبيع إملاك الدولة عن طريق المزاد العلني. بناء على هذا الشيء صار مزاد علني، جزء منهم اشتروهم، ما عدا مجموعة محلات تجارية لا يزال باقي مصيرها مجهول وما حد يعرف كيف يصير، لأن هذا بنت بوقتها بزمن الداعش على العقارات مشتركة بين وزارة البلدية ووزارة الصحة، فهذين الوزارتين لا يزال عندهم مشاكل على هذا الشيء والأمور باقي معلق لا يزال. والناس اللي بوقتها أجروها من تنظيم الداعش ولا يزال موجودين بين والمحلات شغال، بس ما عندهم أي مستمسك قانوني وما يقدرون ما يدفعون أي إيجار للدولة، ينتظرون هذا المحلات باقي معلق. نتكلم عن موقف القانوني للتصرفات العقارية بين المواطنين خلال فترة الداعش. طبعا هذا 3 سنوات صار بيع وشراء وإيجار كثير بين المواطنين، لأن الحياة كان مستمر صح، يعني ماكو حكومة وحكومة سيطرة داعش كان موجود في هذه المناطق، بس بيع وشراء كان موجود. بالنسبة للتصرفات العقارية، أي تصرف عقاري بيع وشراء لازم ينسجل في دائرة تسجيل عقاري، لأن يعتبر عقد البيع من عقود الشكلية. إذا ما بيركن ما بي يعني يعتبر نقص واحد من الأركان، إذا ما سجلت دائرة تسجيل عقاري يعتبر باطل، هذا باطل. وزائدا بناء على قرار مجلس قيادة الثورة عندنا هذا القرار رقم 1198 لسنة 1977، هذا يعتبر قرار استثنائي على تسجيل ممتلكات خارج دائرة التسجيل العقاري. إذا شخص أو شخصين باع ومشتري اشتروا الأرض وباع الأرض ما سجلت بدائرة التسجيل العقاري ما يعتبر باطل، في حال إذا الشخص اللي مشتري الأرض أو المنزل أو البيت استلم وسكن فيه، بس في حال إذا ما سكن فيه هذا يعتبر الباطل.
So we are not seeing the presentation of Mr. Sharif. Either anyone can help us while you are continue your presentation. Yeah.
Now do you see?
Still not. So carry on to avoid interrupting you. Carry on, please.
Yeah, no worry. I just try to show you.
Yes, now you can see it. Now you can see it. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess some technical issue. Should I go on? Should I carry on? Sorry.
Yes, you can continue.
Okay. هناك حالات عندنا 3 حالات نختصرها. في حالات اللي تصرفات عقارية والبيع والشراء صار بين المواطنين خلال سيطرة حكم الداعش. في الحالة الأولى إذا وجدت مكاتبة بين البائع والمشتري يبين اتفاقية بيع وشراء. أكو مواطنين صاروا بيع وشراء العقارات مسوين مسودة شهود 2 وطرفين موقعين على هذا المسودة. بعد التحرير لتلك المناطق حكومة ودائرة تسجيل حكومة خصوصا المحاكم البدائية اعترفت بهذا الشيء، لأن موجود التوقيع حي 2 طرفين البائع والمشتري، وموجود الشهود التوقيعهم، وموجود الإقرار. بناء على هذا تحولت الملكية، لأن تحويل الملكية الأصل لازم دائرة التسجيل العقاري، مفروض يكون ينسجل بدائرة التسجيل العقاري، ولكن عندنا قرار استثناء قرار رقم 1189 أو هذا قرار مجلس قيادة الثورة سنة 1977 البيع أو نقل الملكية لعقارات اللي خارج عن دائرة التسجيل العقاري في حال إذا الشخص استلم البيت وسكن فيها. في هذا الحالة ما تواجهه الناس كثير من المشاكل. ولكن الحالة الثانية إذا وجد المكاتبة بين البائع والمشتري بين الاتفاقية بيع وشراء بين الطرفين، ولكن لا يرغب البائع بنقل الملكية للمشتري بسبب فروقات الأسعار. كثير من الناس ندموا أو نكلوا بالبيع، مثلا قالوا احنا تحت الضغط أو التهديد بعنا عقاراتنا ومنزلنا، ولكن بعد التحرير رجعوا عن البيع. فالمحاكم كيف تصرفت ويا تلك المشاكل؟ في حال إذا الشخص اللي مشتري البيت والساكن ومستلم العقار، هذا باعتبار عقد كامل ومفروض إذا باقي الفلوس يدفع الفلوس للشخص البائع. في حال إذا ما ساكن فيها ويعتبر هذا البيت، لازم الشخص اللي مشتري البيت يرجع اللي بايع البيت عفوا يرجع الفلوس مع الفروقات بين ذاك الزمن وحاليا. شوف ايش قد يكون فرق، وهذا الفرق يتم تحديدها من قبل خبراء قضائيين، وشوف ايش قد الفرق لازم يرجعها، وبيعتبر عملية البيع ما متمم وما كامل. حالة ثالثة، إذا قام الشخص بالحصول على قرار تمليك على عقار معين قبل سيطرة تنظيم داعش على المحافظة النينوى، بعد التحرير مدينة بين أن صاحب العقار قد انتمى إلى داعش. في عندنا حالات شخص مشتري وعنده قرار تمليك من محكمة، ولكن لا يزال دائرة التسجيل العقاري ما مسجل باسمه. خلال فترة حكم داعش ظهرت هذا الشخص اللي بايع العقار منتمي إلى تنظيم داعش، وهذا الشخص حاليا اللي مستند باسمه بعد التحرير يريد يحول دائرة التسجيل العقاري على اسمه، ولكن ما يتحول، لأن هذا الإضبارة أو باسم المالك اللي منتمي إلى داعش عليه تجميد بدائرة التسجيل العقاري، لا يتحول الملكية إلا بموافقة الاستخبارات والأمن الوطني أو موافقة الأمنية والتصريح الأمني احنا اللي نسميه. هذا التصريح الأمني طبعا جهات الأمنية عندهم قاعدة بيانات مالتهم، أي شخص منتمي إلى تنظيم داعش عناصر الداعش ما يقدر يتحول أو يتحكم بالملكية ولا يزال ملكيته مجمد. راح نجي عليه بعدين بتفاصيل شنو مصير ممتلكات للجفيات. الحلول الواقعية للتصرفات بين المواطنين خلال سيطرة حكم داعش. التصرفات التي تتم بين المواطنين يخص بيع وشراء ومع توفير رضا بين الطرفين. طبعا اللي صار تصرفات عقارية كبيع والشراء إذا كان الطرفين برضائهم ما صار نكول بعد التحرير، يتحول الملكية بحسب الأصول يسجلون بدائرة التسجيل العقاري، ما عندهم مشكلة. ولكن معالجة قضايا اللي كان فيه النكول أو في رجعة للبيع وما كان أكو مكاتبة بيناتهم، هذين الحالات بعض منهم انحلت عن طريق قضاء. ممكن إذا الشخص ما عنده أي سند قانوني وما عنده مكاتبة، الحل الوحيد في هيك حالة فقط المحكمة أو الشخص الخصم مثلا المدعى عليه، المدعي يقدر يواجه اليمين المدعى عليه فقط نسميه يمين الحاسمة، وبعد هذا القضية هذا الخطوة يعتبر نزاع انتهت. إذا الشخص حلف يمين أمام القاضي أمام المحكمة باعتبار إذا شخص نكل أنه ضاحت حقوقه وانحلت القضية بهذه الطريقة. وعن طريق العرف طبعا خصوصا المناطق الريفية أو الرورال ارياز اللي نسميه، وحتى داخل مدن العرف فعال جدا في العراق في المجتمع العراقي. يعني كثير مشاكل الأرض وسكن الملكية يتم معالجتها عن طريق العرف، هذا الطريقة الفعالة وكثير حلت المشاكل عن طريق العرف. وعندنا مشكلة اللوخ بخصوص الدور المسيحيين، كان بوقتها صار ضجة كبيرة وواسع جدا لأن هم أقلية قليل عددهم في محافظة نينوى، ومن زمان كان منذ السنين كان ساكنين هناك، وتم تهجيرهم أو إخلاء قسري بشكل إجباري. وبعد التحرير المناطق شكلوا اللجنة يسموه لجنة إعادة الدور المسيحيين. طبعا من هذا اللجنة تشكلت برئاسة بالمبادرة من محافظة نينوى والدعم من الديوان مجلس الوزراء، تم إعادة الدور كل المسيحيين حسب ما سوينا اللقاء مع رئيس اللجنة وانحلت اللجنة لأن كمل مهامها. هذا بشكل عام الحلول اللي مشاكل انحلت. نتكلم بخصوص المشاكل اللي لا يزال متعلق مصير ممتلكات مسجلة بأسماء المنتمون إلى تنظيم الداعش. طبعا عناصر الداعش آلاف أو مئات الألف الناس اللي انتموا للداعش اللي انقتلت، اللي بعدها مطلوب قضائيا، اللي محكموا عليه قضائيا محكومين نعتبرهم.
Mr. Sharif, you have 2 minutes remaining.
أوكي. فهذني لا يزال أموالهم ما صادرت بناء على قانون مكافحة الإرهاب، يعتبر معلق ممتلكاتهم، ولا تجمدت إلا الفترة الأخيرة صدر أكثر من قرارين أو 3 بالتجميد أموال معينين من الإرهابيين، والبقية الأموال باقي معلق ما حد يقدر يتصرف بها، لا عوائلهم ولا ينتقل للإرث. حق النساء باكتساب الملكية عن طريق الإرث. طبعا الدستور العراقي كفل ونص بحق التمليك أو ملكية بدون تمييز للنساء والرجال، وهذا موجود بإعلان عالمي لحقوق الإنسان، ولكن هناك حالتين متعلقة بالإرث بحقوق النساء لتمتلكون العقار. إذا كان المسجل البيت أو العقار مسجل باسم زوج أو زوجة أو ابن، وهذا منتمي إلى داعش، هذا زوج أو زوجة أو ابن، في هيك حالة الزوجة لا يرث ولا ينتقل الملكية إلى الورثة بسبب انتماء هذا الشخص للداعش، سواء كان مفقود أو مطلوب أو مقتول. وهذا يعتبر مجمد لحد الآن، لا يوجد قرار أو تشريع واضح بخصوص هذا الشيء، ويعتبر عجز على إضباره في دائرة التسجيل العقاري. في حال إذا أحد الورثة منتمي لداعش، مو الشخص المالك الرئيسي، أكثر من المالكين، في هيك حالة بقية الورثة لازم يعملون بالطريقة اللي يسمون إخبار أو تبرئة عن طريق المحكمة التحقيق، يتبرون من هذا الشخص أو يخبرون بأن هذا الشخص منتمي إلى تنظيم داعش ويتبرون منه، وهذا تأثير كبير أو آثار قانوني يترتب على هذا. بناء على هذا الإخبار يصدر على هذا الشخص حكم أو أمر إلقاء قبض وفق القانون إرهاب، وهذا هم يؤثر على المشاكل العائلية. آليات التسوية منازعات عقارية بشكل عام، الوسائل القضائية وغير قضائية نقسم هنا. بخصوص الوسائل القضائية عندنا محكمة البداء ومحكمة التحقيق المختصين، خصوصا غصب ممتلكات، لأن كثير من البيوت لا يزال غاصب من قبل نازحين أو عائدين أو ساكنين بحسن النية أو بسيء النية أو ليس لديهم أي مأوى ساكنين في هذه المناطق، أو الناس اللي متنفذين وعندهم السلطة ساكنين في بيوت اللي تعود ملكيتها للناس اللي منتمين للداعش، ولا يزال هذا يترتب عليه الغاصب لولا، هذا معلق ويحتاج إلى قرار. بخصوص المحكمة البداءة الطريقة المدنية لحل النزاعات. والوسائل غير قضائية عندنا التحكيم والصلح والعرف والوسائل التعاونية لحل المنازعات عن طريق الوساطة والمفاوضة. طبعا التحكيم طريقة غير فعالة في العراق لا يزال. الصلح في الدعاوى المدنية وبين المواطنين، سواء كان قبل طرح النزاع على المحكمة أو بعدها، هذا هم فعال نسبيا. وعرف وسيلة فعالة لحل النزاعات خارج عن المحكمة. نحكي على حالة اللي صار في قضاء سنجار. التقينا بالعائلة، العائلة عائدين من المخيمات وراجعين المنطقة بيتهم مهدوم، ساكنين بيت شخص. هذا الشخص بعد تحرير منطقة سنجار تهربت، ما نعرف هذا منتمي للداعش لو لا، أو عنده أي موقف الأمني سليم لو لا. بس السؤال هنا، هذا مثال مال عائلة واحدة، عندنا مئات أو آلاف العوائل ومناطق مختلفة في العراق، خصوصا هذين الأربع محافظات كانت تحت سيطرة الداعش. شنو مصير هذا الشخص اللي قاعد ببيت وليس لديه سند ملكية ولا إذن من المالك؟ هل هذا الشخص يعتبر ساكن البيت غاصب العقار؟ إذا نشوف وفق القانون أي شخص إذا ما عنده سند قانوني وما عنده موافقة أو إذن المالك يعتبر هذا الشخص غاصب. فالشخص اللي راجع فوق هو متضرر، نزحت خلال سنين وراجع للمنطقة ويترتب عليه آثار قانونية، يعتبر هذا الشخص غاصب. ممكن غير الناس عندهم سيء النية أو مثلا مو حسنين النية، بس أصحاب النفوذ هم ساكنين بيوت غير الناس أو منتمين أو ترجع ملكيتها للداعش. وهل يحق الساكن المنزل بالمطالبة بالنفقات مصروفات التي ترمى منزل من مالك العقار؟ طبعا ما قرأت قصة، بس في ناس ساكنين في البيوت.
Mr. Sharif, I'm sorry, but you have to conclude your presentation with others.
2 minutes I will finish.
1 minute.
اوكي دوري. الشخص اللي صارف على البيوت، لان البيوت اللي راجع، الشخص اللي قاعد، العائله اللي قاعده في البيت مسوي مصاريف على البيت، هل يحق له ياخذ هذه المصاريف من المالك العقار الاصلي لو لا؟ وهل يحق للمالك اقامه الدعوى منع معارض الاستدار منزله؟ مثلا الشخص المالك عنده حق بانه يعتبر الشخص اللي ساكن في البيت هذا غاصب يسترجع بيته عن طريق دعوى منع معارضه؟ وهل يحق للمالك العقار مطالبة بالأجر مثل لصاحب الدار بعد ما استرجع البيت أو منزله، وأن له حق وفق القانون يطلب بالأجر المثل؟ طبعا هذا كلها آثار قانونية ويترتب عليه ووفق القضاء، ولكن لا تمت معالجتها لحد الآن، ويحتاج قرار أو تشريع سريع. الاستنتاجات بشكل ملخص: بعض المنازعات العقارية جزء منها حلت بالوسائل القضائية وغير قضائية، وهناك حالات كثير للإشغال الثانوي لا تزال معلق، وكذلك ممتلكات عقارية مسجلة بأسماء المنتمين إلى تنظيم داعش، ولم يتم حلها لعدم وجود قرار بهذا الصدد لحد الآن. طبعا نحاول نلخص كم توصيات بإصدار. مثلا أول توصية من جانب الحكومة: الدعم المنظمات الإنسانية لهذه الفئات ممكن يحل بشكل جزئي أو بشكل وقتي لهذين العوائل أو لهذين المشاكل، بس الحل الأساسي يم الحكومة مفروض حكومة تقام بإصدار تشريع أو قانون.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, but I'm going to interrupt you because you spoke more than 20 minutes.
I'm already finished. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shukran. Sorry, really sorry about it.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Thank
Any
you
questions?
Yeah. You have 2 questions from John Unru. John, can you come in, please?
Sorry, what? Please say that again.
You have 2 questions from John Unru. I asked John Unru.
Yes, okay, please. Let's go ahead, please.
John?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well, John. Please come in.
Yes, thank you very much to all presenters. Fascinating topics. The first is to the last speaker. I'm wondering if the decree by the Iraqi government to make invalid any transactions of property in ISIS-held areas, is there any evidence that that slowed down or stopped any transaction by ISIS of that property?
Yes. Should I answer in Arabic or English? Okay. حسب ما افتهمته من السؤال، بالنسبة لأي مرسوم من قبل الحكومة العراقية للبطلان هذين المعاملات البيع والشراء، طبعا صدرت بوقتها وزارة العدل بوقف، صدر قرار بالبطلان جميع التصرفات العقارية، ولكن إذا كان أكو رضا بين الطرفين، مثلا خصوصا عمليات البيع والشراء، إذا البائع والمشتري بعد التحرير راجعوا لدائرة التسجيل العقاري أو محكمة البداءة للحصول على قرار التمليك، في هذه الحالة يعتبر بيع صحيح والدولة ما عندها مشكلة، لأن أكو إقرار وطرفين راضين باعتبار بيع جديد. وفي حالات النكول اللي صارت، هذا فقط إذا الشخص اللي مشتري عقار ساكن في البيت، ويعتبر وفق القرار مجلس قيادة الثورة رقم 1198 لسنة 1997. وفق هذا القرار يتم تمليك في حال إذا الشخص المشتري ساكن في البيت، استلم بيته بوقته وساكن فيه. وفي حال إذا ما مستلم البيت وأكو ادعاء بأنه الشخص بايع البيت والثاني المشتري وجزء من الفلوس ماخذ، في هيك حالة فقط إذا ماكو دليل كتابي بين الطرفين البائع والمشتري، فقط إلى حق المدعي أو الشخص اللي مشتري العقار فقط يوجه اليمين حاسمة للشخص الطرف المقابل المدعى عليه، وهذا الشخص في هيك حالة إذا حلف يمين بأنه ما صار أي بيع وشراء بيناتهم، وهذا يعتبر باطل. وفي حالات صارت كان بالتهديد، أكو ادعاءات بأنه تهديد من قبل الناس المتنفذين أو من قبل الداعش بأنه صار تحت ضغط تهديد باعوا العقاراتهم، هذا الحالة يعتبر إذا التهديد من قبل داعش يصير اتهام وفق القانون مكافحة الإرهاب أو وفق القانون الجنائي، هم يعتبر تهديد. بس هم تواجهون المشكلة كيف يثبتون هذا الشيء وشنو دليلهم؟ عندهم شهود أو أكو دلائل بأنه باعد عقار أو بيته تحت الضغط؟ واضح؟
Thank you, Mr. Sharif. Colleague, dear audience, yeah, you hear these three presentations, which has 4 presentations and very inspiring. So the floor is open. Either any question, any complement of information you want to share. The floor is open. So I can see one hand in the room. Please
Yes.
proceed.
أيوة السلام عليكم.
السلام.
دكتورة سميرة شاوش UN هابيتات من اليمن. أنا معايا ملاحظتين لتالا، واحدة تالا واحدة لنيكون وليلى. ممكن؟ أستاذ عمر؟ It's okay؟ أوكي، بالنسبة لتالا كانت من ضمن التوصيات to ensure alternative housing for the temporary displaced. من وجهة نظرك في التجربة اللبنانية كيف كان ممكن توفير هذه البدائل؟ لأنه كان انفجار كبير ومساحات واسعة دمرت، فكيف يعني في تصورك كيف ممكن توفير هذه المباني أو الأشياء المؤقتة؟ هذا بالنسبة لتالا. بالنسبة لنيكون وليلى، التجربتين متشابهة في سوريا وكردستان من ناحية التقارب ما بين اللاجئين في لبنان والنازحين جراء الحرب والظروف القاسية في كردستان. رأينا أنماط مختلفة من التكوينات والتجمعات للنازحين. هذه كلها تجعلنا نسأل سؤال مهم. من خلال هذه التجارب والأمثلة والمعرفة المتراكمة للإيجابيات والسلبيات لهذه التجارب، هل بالإمكان نستطيع تطوير موديل أو نموذج أو عدة نماذج مع مجموعة من السيناريوهات يمكن أن تكون جاهزة ومناسبة لاستخدامها لإدارة الأراضي ومخيمات النازحين في حالة الأزمات في البيئات التي قد تكون قابلة لتطبيق مثل هذه النماذج؟ شكرا أستاذ عمر.
Thank you very much. You want to come in? Tala, you start first, please.
Sure. رح أحكي بالعربي. شكرا للسؤال. حسب ما صار الموضوع بنطاق الانفجار المرفأ ببيروت، صار في تحديد للأماكن الشاغرة. يعني في كتير شقق ومساكن ضمن بيروت الإدارية هي فارغة، فصار في تحديد لنسبة الفيكنسي ريت مثل ما بيقولوا بهدول المناطق، والتواصل مع أصحاب هدول البيوت لترتيب اتفاق سكن مؤقت، خصوصي للعائلات اللي هن كانوا ساكنين ببنى فيه خطر الانهيار، لأنه هدول العيال كانوا أكثر شيء بحاجة لسكن مؤقت بالوقت السريع. بحالة العيال الثانية اللي كان في ضرر جزئي ببيتهم، كان في تحرك كتير سريع للمؤسسات الأمم المتحدة والمجتمع المدني مشان ينعمل إعادة تأهيل للمساكن بالوقت اللي الأهل البيت ساكنين جوات البيت، يعني ما اضطروا أنه يعملوا ريلوكيشن. فهو حسب مستوى الضرر يلي صار بالبيوت والاسسمنت، الماركت اسسمنت بالمنطقه اللي هي قريبه لمنطقه الانفجار، لانه كان في كثير ناس عم بفكروا انه هن ما بدهم يبعدوا عن المنطقه، بدهم يقدروا يضلوا يجوا يطلوا على البيت، يمكن مدارس اولادهم بالمنطقه هي بذاتها، فما كان في يصير في سكن بديل بعيد كثير عن منطقه الانفجار. فحسب ما صارت هذا كان طريقة ترتيب هذا الموضوع.
Thank you very much, Tala. You want to come in, Leila?
Nicole, you can go first, and then I will go after.
رح جاوب كمان بالعربي. ميرسي كثير على السؤال. رح أقول بس كرمال إذا فينا نطول جهاز لإدارة الأراضي اليوم بالمنطقة اللي نحن فيها. رح أحكي عن لبنان لأن خبرتي أكثر على لبنان. اليوم بين خبرة لبنان بالوجود اللاجئين إن كان من المخيمات الفلسطينية، اللجوء الفلسطيني ولا اللجوء السوري. أكيد اليوم نحن قادرين نطور أجهزة لإدارة المخيمات ولإدارة الأراضي ولإدارة اللجوء والوجود اللاجئين على الأراضي اللبنانية. بس اليوم المشكلة منا تكنيك، منا تقنية. اليوم المشكلة هي أول شيء سياسية بالنسبة للهوست كونتري اللي عم يستقبل هول اللاجئين، وبالنسبة للبلد اللي جايين منه هول اللاجئين، إنه هي يقدروا ياخذوا قرار من هالمشكلة. هي من ميلة. ومن ميلة ثانية اليوم لما يكون اليوم أقل on average بيقعدوا الريفوجي 17.
I'm sorry to interrupt you guys, but could you raise your voice a little bit? We can't hear you.
And now?
Better?
Hear me now?
A little bit more. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll try to speak
Much
louder.
better now.
كنت عم بقول انه اليوم من الخبره اللي عنا اياها نحن بلبنان بالوجود اللاجئين ان كان الفلسطينيه ولا السوريه، اكيد عنا التقنيه لنقدر نطور الاداه اللي عايزينها ولا الاجهزه اللي عايزينها لاداره الاراضي ولاداره هوستنج هول الريفوجيز. المشكله اليوم هي منا تقنيه، المشكله اليوم هي اول شيء سياسيه من ميله لبنان من وجود اللاجئين، وكمان من ميله من وين جايين هول اللاجئين. هي واحدة تانية هي المشكلة من السيستم اليوم المعمول تبع الهيومانيتاريان ايد. لما نحن نمول على اساس هن باقيين سنة وسنة جاي راجعين على بلدهم ويرجعوا سنة جاي يبقوا. اليوم نحن بنعرف انه اغلبية اللاجئين اليوم بيبقوا on average 17 سنة بهول البيوت بهالبلاد. نحن من الاساس فينا نطلع على المشكلة as a protracted situation، وفي حال رجعوا او في حال مش الحال ونحل الكونفليكت فيهم يرجعوا. إذا بلشنا نحن من المنظور من الأساس طلعنا مش بس humanitarian emergency وهي المشكلة وهلأ على سنة، وفكرنا فيه على on a development point of view، اشتغلنا humanitarian development لحتى نقدر ندور لنقدر ندير هذا الأراضي ولا للسكن housing لللاجئين بالبلاد تبعنا. خلص.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Leila, you want to come in?
Yes. So I will keep it in English, just again for the terminologies. So again, the question, I would also complement what Nicole was saying and think about these aggregation of settlements. We always think about the occupational group. We don't think of space. We always think about time as a temporary, but we don't know how long is temporary. And again, thinking about these systems, they exist. The idea of housing refugees exists since any war has started. The idea has transformed the political situation of the refugee from a humanitarian to a political situation, thus included how it affected the settlements. The models do exist. The idea of how to think about these spaces as receiving structures, this is number one. The number two is thinking about centralized and decentralized systems. And the most important part is thinking about the prolonged conflict and the infrastructural situation in the hosting country. Because there's difference between countries who have good and powerful infrastructure compared to what happens to refugees, or the structures or the situations similar to Iraq and Yemen, I guess, the infrastructural fatigue or the non-existent infrastructure. So how these systems should develop as maybe to a certain extent as self-sustaining systems is the question. Then maybe we will need to think more of now the approach in different European countries as moving to circular. So how do we develop a system that is circular, that closes its loop, that it is less dependent on the hosting community, but on the other way around, how can the hosting community actually benefit from the systems that these aggregations bring? This is what I would suggest that we focus on later. In regard of the land, yes, I'm done.
Hi.
Yes.
I was just, we're just making sure that Mr. Frank Samuel is going to present.
Right.
So
No,
I understand this.
let's take it this way, because we are, please, I'm the boss of this session. Allow me to do it this way. May I ask Frank to just in 5 minutes to tell us what GIZ is doing in Syria and what are the key lessons you want to share here. Okay, Frank, please, without any presentation, the floor. Thank you. Is Frank around? I cannot hear Frank. So then, I mean, is there any other question from the floor, from the audience? No. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Shukran, shukran wallaka. It was a very inspiring session. We hear a lot of experience from the research perspective to the programmatic aspect. Of course, we see some challenges related to the housing and land property. Many parts like Syria and Lebanon with a new move, but still there's a big, a number of experience that we can tap in and to scale up and to make sure at least this issue of land in the context of crisis is serving the purpose of communities, but also opening the door for best recovery and building back better, as you mentioned it. I would like to thank again the organizers of this conference and all panelists for taking time to prepare this brilliant presentation. I'm sure people, if you need any of this presentation, you can liaise with the organizers of this conference, and we look forward to continue engaging during the 2 days. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.